Welcome back to Marketing Actively, a podcast by ZOMA where we're speaking to entrepreneurs, business owners and C-suite executives about their business, their journey, and how to use physical activity as a means of creative expression and stress relief. And someone who is, I think, probably almost most applicable to this, because there's another angle from not just the physical end, but I don't know what the right word is. I'm going to say mental and spiritual and psychological end, is Pat Divilly. Thanks a million for coming down, Pat.
Yeah, nice one. Thank you for having me. It's cool to it's cool to blend the different worlds. Sometimes I'm on business podcasts and I was telling you I don't really feel like a businessman. Yeah. And then other times on spiritual podcasts talking woo-woo. So it's nice to get to merge all of my worlds.
Yeah, something different. So I wanted to kind of start with the Japanese concept of ikigai, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah.
Is essentially merging what you love, what you're good at, and something else, but how you can monetize it all and kind of find your true calling, essentially, of something that you can make a living out of, that you enjoy and you're good at. And it seems like from the outside that you've gone on a unique journey to get to where you are, in a very unique space, but it seems like you've definitely found that within your life. Would you agree?
Yeah, it doesn't always feel smooth. It definitely sometimes feels like all over the place and a bit lost and kind of unsure of myself. And in some ways, I came from the fitness industry, and I often tell people part of me wishes I was still back there, because it's very easy to kind of express what you do from a marketing standpoint. I help people lose weight. I'm looking for 5 guys that want to put on muscle. These kind of, it's quite clear. It's which is obviously important in business, to be able to tell your clients kind of the specific tangible outcome that you're going to be able to give them. And then as I've gone more into emotional and mental wellness and spiritual wellness, it's like not as succinct or clear. Like I'm writing a book at the moment about the shadow self, which is like the dark parts of us that we try to hide. My publisher sent me back a response to my first draft, and they're like, "We know it's kind of a heavy topic. Can you make it more fun?" I'm like, well, sometimes this stuff is not fun. But
not everything has to be entertainment. Sometimes there's a little bit of introspection required that's not always going to be enjoyable.
Yeah, and so I think the third part of that ikigai, so there's what you're good at, what you love, and I think the third part is kind of what the world needs.
That was the other one. That's what I was missing. Yeah,
that's the bit that sometimes I need to kind of pull myself in on. Is I can't just live my life based on. Well, you can live your life based on your passions, but I think it's important to be honest with yourself about. Like I go down these rabbit holes of studying archetypes and depth psychology and all this mad stuff, and I want to share it with men, particularly in men's groups. And then the guys come to my sessions, they're just like, we just want somewhere to go and have a chat with other boys. And it's like, okay, so it's not what I think it is. And I think that's important in business too, is you've got a concept in your mind as to what it's going to be, but you have to be kind of open to the market giving their take on what they actually need.
Yeah, be a bit more fluid with the idea and not kind of concrete and rigid about this is the path I want to go, and trying to find people to kind of fit into that, rather than being a little bit more fluid and being adaptable then to what people actually want, let's say.
Yeah.
Like I understand that from, I suppose we didn't really say who you are and what you do. Maybe give it just a quick overview for anyone who's been living under a rock and doesn't know who you are.
I'm 36, so I'm about 15, 16 years in the wellness industry. I started in fitness, failed pretty miserably with my first fitness business, which was when I was in my early 20s. And I was a bit lost for a while, really struggled with my mental health. And I started again. Back then I was like 24, moved back in with my parents, left with Dublin, which was where I had moved to become successful, and all this young ego.
Up in the big smoke.
Honest to God, it was that like old cliche story, like, I'm going to become somebody, because I was really insecure. I didn't believe in myself and I thought I'd become successful. So I came back to Galway, moved back in with my parents, worked in a pizza shop, and I started teaching fitness classes just as a kind of sideline to save some money to go back to college or do something with my life. And the classes kind of took off for some reason. And for a couple of years I did fitness. I went from 5 clients locally to 20,000 all over the world through online fitness programs. Then I kind of fell out of love with it. My take in life is that you have lessons to learn, and once you've learned the lessons, you can just keep doing the same thing, or you can kind of move on to the next thing. So then I moved into mental wellness, coaching, CBT, personal development, started doing seminars and workshops and retreats. And then the last couple of years, it's been more a bit deeper, I would say, the work. It's less about just goals and time management and that very tangible stuff, and more about helping people find meaning and purpose and depth in their lives. So I would say 15 years in the wellness space. First it was physical, then mental, then emotional, and it just goes deeper and deeper. And outside of that, I'm a world traveler. I love to travel a couple of months of every year. I'm a brown belt in jiu-jitsu, and I'm an eternal student and teacher, I would say.
Yeah, that's one thing that I notice from a distance with you, is that you're always challenging yourself to a certain extent, upskilling, training, finding different avenues within what you enjoy and what you're trying to do, that you can kind of, like what you're saying about what the world needs, trying to get that, especially with men at the moment. Or I know it's becoming more of a thing where men are a little bit more open, like you're saying, they just want a space to chat. But I do feel like there's a lot more of a personal development, introspection aspect that men are getting more comfortable with, maybe, than they would have in the past, especially in Ireland, especially from an Irish context, where the traditional ignore it and brush it under the carpet and just be a man's man and move on, that's never the best approach, and it hasn't really worked out in the past. And there was probably an element of that with you saying, like, I know you said you felt like you feel like a fraud from a business entrepreneur standpoint, but you did have a legitimate business, Pat. You had 20,000 clients as a personal trainer. That's quite good. Like, but then to, let's say, have a failure before that, it does have a lasting impact. And I know where you're coming from to a certain extent. I thought when I was in a 9-to-5 job, let's say, after coming out of college, I was in my dream job, and I thought, yeah, this is where I want to be, this is what I want to do. Very, very quickly I realized this isn't for me. I was into training and bodybuilding at the time. I thought, I'll try and be a personal trainer. Found out very quickly I didn't enjoy that either. So it was like trying to find what's the avenue, and you can get to a dark place in that, and it's trying to, like, be open to speaking to people. And I know from your point of view that you've delved so deep into the different avenues, maybe, or the different channels of, like you're saying, about the deeper parts of ourselves, that a lot of people will never go that deep, and probably don't need to go that deep. But to have someone like you that has the knowledge of that and be able to guide them from a more surface level point of view, but with that deeper understanding, I think that's very important as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you've any sense, don't dive as deep as I dive. Yeah, I think we're all in this journey of life for different reasons and have different things to do. And one of the things that always give me kind of relief, and also relief, I suppose, when I'm struggling or when I'm a bit lost or confused, is again that idea that we came into the world to have an experience, to learn certain lessons, to meet certain people that will help you with those lessons. And they're not all nice lessons. You might need to learn about forgiveness and heartbreak and self-love and self-acceptance and holding bound, all these different lessons. And so if you can kind of approach your life from that perspective, that you've got your ego and I've got my ego that wants to become a black belt in jiu-jitsu and wants to be successful and all these different things, but that's all me. But then there's life, and life gives you all this experience, and how you approach that is kind of the bigger picture, I think, beyond your ego. It's like Mike Tyson's thing, everyone's going to plan till they get hit in the face. I guess years ago I was kind of big on goal setting, and if you just set goals and go after them, you're going to feel happy. But that's not how life works. It's nice to have direction, it's nice to have goals, but the deeper lens is, if we don't have a bit of introspection, I think we just play out the same cycles throughout our lives. In the business world, the big one I would probably see is people that are driven by insecurity, and their father never told them they loved them, and so now they're trying to get the world to tell them that they're loved and they're enough. So that's the value.
Sometimes I feel like I'm in that position. Sometimes I feel like what drives me is insecurity.
Me too.
It's but then it's that thing of, that's okay as well, as long as you're aware of it, as long as you're conscious that maybe there's something missing deeper down that is driving you towards, like, I'm quite big on goal setting. We have a mutual friend in Gary Fox, who is kind of something that we've spoken about a lot, is goals and targets. And but again, back to what you were saying earlier about being fluid, that they're fluid, moving obstacles or objects or targets. They're not something set that if you end up going off path, that's where the kind of mental health kind of aspect to it can come in, where you're going, well, I'm off track here, and you start to spiral a little bit. But what I do find is that, or what I have found over the last couple of years, is that concentrating on that journey towards that goal, that's the more enjoyable piece. And obviously we have a mutual connection in terms of jiu-jitsu as well, and that's one thing that I find in jiu-jitsu especially. And I always thought that, I said it to a lot of people when I was probably still a white belt or coming into blue belt, that jiu-jitsu is for everyone. Everyone, it encompasses everything that you need from a physical and mental point of view. And I've changed that, flipped it, that everyone should try it, just from a point of view to know what someone who's very small can do to you, but also from a point of view of seeing, like, the way I describe it to people, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, you might be a bit more qualified to speak about this, but meditation, essentially, if you boil it down, is being present and in the moment. And you can't be any more present and in the moment than if someone's trying to choke you or rip a limb off. So using jiu-jitsu as I don't like really using the metaphors of sport and business, but I do think there's a big correlation between that journey through jiu-jitsu and getting to, it's obviously a long journey to get to black belt for most people anyway, and then using that as a metaphor for you can have an end target, but you're going to veer off that path, and that path is going to wind along the way, and you're going to have ups and downs. You're going to have sessions where you feel like, I'm absolutely useless at this and I don't know why I ever started. But it's trying to enjoy that as you're doing it, and kind of appreciate that almost meditative aspect of it.
Yeah, I think there's a few things in that. Similarly, I probably would have always pushed people toward jiu-jitsu, and still do to a certain degree, but the bigger picture is all humans have needs, and for you to feel fulfilled and happy in your life, you've got to meet your needs. So we all have different needs to a certain degree. Like, everyone needs food, needs shelter, needs connection, but then there's other needs that we might have. Like, I need jiu-jitsu in my life to feel I'm at my best. I need a creative outlet to help me deal with anxiety. I need like-minded people who help me feel like I'm not the only one in the world that is doing this exploration work. And typically when those needs go unmet in my life, I struggle, and I can ask myself kind of what's off here, what's off kilter. And when I meet my needs, generally I feel better. So I say that because, when I owned the gym years ago, people would come in and they'd say, like, I've tried to do the gym for the last 10 years and I do it in January and then I always fall off. I'd say, what's the need you're trying to fulfill here? They say, I want to be fit. And I'd say, there's a million ways to get fit. You don't have to do it in the gym. So probably similar, as you say, like, if the need, for me, some of the needs that I would say jiu-jitsu fulfills for me is a sense of community. There's probably a healthy outlet for aggression and, competitiveness. There is a meditative quality. It's a social community. It's physically active. It's mental chess. So it ticks a lot of boxes. But obviously all those boxes can be ticked in different ways, and they can be ticked in destructive ways. Like when I was in my 20s, I ticked all the same boxes in the pub. So it was a social outlet. It quieted my mind. It was meditative in some ways. I work with people on addiction sometimes, because their addictions often are them trying to meet their needs in destructive ways. And when they can kind of look at it from the outside, that's what meditation is stepping back and being able to see the bigger picture. They can see, oh, my gambling addiction is giving me a sense of adventure in an otherwise boring life. How else could I meet that sense of adventure in a healthy way? So it's probably a bit of a deep answer, but that's a lot of what I would look at with this. But
I think that's a common theme is with a lot of your answers is probably the depth that you're going to go into. Yeah.
But for me, the meditation piece, I think a lot of meditation is we've all built stories about who we are. So I have an identity, I have a sense of who I am. It's what helps me feel safe and make sense of the world. And when we get too wrapped up in who we are, we're wrapped up in our ego, and our world gets kind of small. I've become very limited. I'm Pat, and I'm a writer, and I'm a jiu-jitsu guy, and I live in Galway, and I'm currently single, and I like to travel. That's a tiny fraction of my possibility, but the more ego-driven someone is, the more kind of trapped in a box they are. And when you do any kind of meditation, it blows the box apart, and you're open to like, oh, anything is possible. And I think that's the sense you can sometimes get from jiu-jitsu. Like if you step on the mats, there's a guy there who's a broke student who isn't paying for class, and then you've got maybe a millionaire who's it's an evener, I suppose. It takes away all the hierarchy.
Yeah, I think the best example of that is when you have cops guards, policemen, and someone who they may have arrested in the past training together. I always find that a very interesting dynamic in a jiu-jitsu gym. I think the sense of community is a massive part of it, and that probably comes back as well to what you're saying about men just wanting to have a space to chat. I find that after a jiu-jitsu session, right, I'm just going to say here, a caveat here, I'm going to try and make this not all about jiu-jitsu. I did a podcast with a friend of mine before Christmas on his podcast, and we're friends or whatever, and he wanted to talk a little bit about business and marketing. He's a personal trainer, and we ended up just talking about jiu-jitsu for an hour and a half. But anyway, the thing about the sense of community and just having a space to chat, I find that after a jiu-jitsu class, when the endorphins are so high and people have got that sense of aggression out, maybe they've got a little bit of competitiveness going, and the endorphins are through the roof, that I find a lot of people, when they sit in the mat after training, are probably a little bit more open than they would be in any other aspect of their life. Which is why I always thought that everyone should be doing this. But I think you affording people a different aspect, a different avenue for that through, say, some of the classes that you do and some of the work that you do. I think it's quite important. Is from a breathwork point of view, I know you're massive on breathwork, and it's quite the opposite then to jiu-jitsu, in that it's complete stillness and calmness, but are you essentially trying to achieve the same outcome?
Yeah, I think it's I think the reason that we can connect, I remember going to Italy with an ex a couple of years ago, and she obviously had English, but none of her friends had any English at all. And so the first couple of days hanging out with all her friends it was grand. It was a bit awkward. I felt like you realize when you travel how ignorant it is to only speak one language. So it was kind of, humbling to be in a group where no one else is speaking English apart from my missus at the time. And so it's a bit awkward. And then a couple of days in, one of them trained jiu-jitsu, so I went and trained, and within 10 minutes we're like best friends. We're really close and all. But I think the reason we have that connection at the end of a class is because there's presence, and presence is when you're not in your head with the stories about how you need to keep yourself safe. And if you think about it, the more stressed you are, the more you are in your head, and the more defensive you are, in terms of, without even realizing it, like the more stressed I am, the more I kind of go to my default setting, which is achieve things and be busy and be productive and be of value. And the more in the moment you become in any practice, whether it's breath work or it's jiu-jitsu, whatever it is, the more all that stuff falls away, because as your body relaxes, there's a two-way conversation always happening. That's what people, I think, don't realize sometimes, is that your thoughts influence how you feel. So if you think you're an awful person, you're going to feel shame. If you think you're a great person, you're going to feel joy, maybe. But also what's happening in your body influences the way you see the world. So when your body's high strung and you've drank too much coffee, your world looks very different to when you've just done a yoga class. So I think that's, again, what jiu-jitsu will offer. But the breath work, there's lots of different forms of breath work. The one that I do is conscious connected breath work. That's kind of my main focus, and that's about helping people to release suppressed emotion. So make a little bit of space for all the times that they felt angry or sad or joy or whatever they felt and didn't allow themselves to feel. When you breathe in a specific way, it switches off the monkey mind and it drops you more into your limbic brain, which is your emotional brain. And then suddenly there's an outpouring of emotion, which can be quite healthy for people, I think.
Yeah, I know you do a lot of like online workshops from that point of view. Do you find that there's a difference in how people engage with it online versus in person? Because I feel like there's so much of, let's say, Zoom, we got so into it during COVID and it was functional, it was fine, but then once we got back in person again, people hate it. And like, even we do video calls at work, and it's very hard a lot of the time to get that connection with someone until you sit down with them in person. But possibly breath work might be something that is almost better done online, because you're in your own space. You have the coaching, let's say, you have the guidance of, let's say, you on the other end of the camera, but you're in your own space and maybe a little bit more comfortable. Do you find that there's much of a difference there in like the physical versus digital there, that people being more comfortable in their own space versus maybe holding back a little bit with other people in the room?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think some of it comes down to the individual and their kind of unique preferences. My dad actually was an accountant for years, and now he does kind of auditing lectures. So he does CPD courses for accountants. And he was saying to me the other day, the in-person stuff has died, like he does in-person sessions and nobody wants to do in-person anymore. But I was saying that's the nature of that type of thing where it's information heavy. I think people want to do it online because they can be doing something else in the background
They
or
can
whatever
kind of switch off, yeah.
Whereas my stuff, because it's more connection based and about meeting people are kind of fed up of online.
Okay.
Now the breathwork's a bit of an exception. People do find it comforting and comfortable, I suppose, to be in their own space, to be able to lie down in their own bed and breathe for an hour. And I suppose my mentality shifts as well as I get older. Like when I was 23, 24, I was just out in nightclubs all the time, and that I thought everyone was free, like I was free. And as you get older, you realize all your clients have kids and grandkids and busy lives and stuff. And for them to come and do a workshop is not the 1 hour that you spend there; it's the babysitter and the couple hours either side. So I think in that case, it helps people. The interesting thing in being in a group in person is it brings up all of the shadowy bits, what I would call shadowy bits that maybe people don't get to confront when they're at home. So there's benefit in doing a breathwork class at home. But for example, if you come to a breathwork class in person and you hear someone crying in the background, that's going to awaken something in you depending on your kind of, some people are not comfortable with their emotions. So when tears come up, that makes them uncomfortable and they want to go and rescue the person. And so it can be an interesting experience for them to recognize, like, what is your response? So there's pros and cons, I think, to both.
Do you find having the background in physical activity helps you from the spiritual and psychological side?
I tell you, it's probably a weird way that it helps. Did you watch that film, documentary Stutz?
No. So
there's a documentary Stutz on Netflix about Jonah Hill. I think he got cancelled or something last year, but before he got cancelled or before people were giving out, he's been going to a therapist for a couple of years called Phil Stutz. He's an older guy from New York. And he's cool. He just he's got his own way of doing things. And I think he said he'd get struck off from any board that he was involved with because he doesn't follow the protocols kind of thing. But one of the things he does is when his client comes and they're struggling with something, he takes these really complex psychological principles and he makes them really simple, and he draws on a handkerchief like something, and he calls them the tools, and he'll send his client home with a tool to work on. So I mentioned the shadow. So he might draw a shadow and he'll say part of your shadow is the part you don't like to see in yourself. Your practice is to go home and kind of recognize that in yourself. Anyway, I watched the documentary, and the first thing he talked about was, regardless of where you're at in life or what's going on or what you're challenged by, the number one thing you can do for yourself is increase your life force. And he had this triangle that represented your life force. And I think it was like your training, your nutrition, and your social circle. So he said it doesn't matter where you're at. So when you ask, does the physical stuff help? I think on a personal level, there's definitely been times where I've gotten lost in the weeds, like trying to figure out all this mental, psychological stuff and my background and my history and my attachment styles and all this, like just getting caught in my head. And so it helped in regard to just recognizing the importance of the basics, because it is easy to get lost in the weeds. And I think that's one of the big challenges with the personal development industry is people read books and they read podcasts and they get excited by these insights that they're having, but they never do anything with the insight. And I think it's got to be a combination of, that's why I go and try new things and do new things, or climb mountains, or just put myself in uncomfortable environments, because I want to actually practice these things that are theories until you actually, put them into your body.
Yeah, it's like you were saying earlier about that aspect of taking learnings but then not doing anything with it. So yeah, it's the same thing of we'll come across issues or problems and we'll find a solution and take a learning from it. But a lot of the time, inherently, it's probably an ego aspect that we push that down and say, oh, that's fine, whatever, that's done, I'll move on. But then you just repeat that cycle. And it is very difficult to break that, regardless of who you are and how aware of that you are. Yeah. It's just an inherent human trait, kind of, I suppose, that maybe habit, is it really?
Yeah, they're all defense mechanisms, defense strategies. I worked with a lady years ago, and I remember she came and she said the one thing she wanted to work on was her relationship. She was married 20 years and she felt she didn't love him anymore and this kind of thing. And that was the one thing she wanted to focus on. And then every time we'd have a call, she'd launch straight into a new business she had launched, or a new book she was reading, or course she had signed up to. And there was all these like not so subtle ways of running away from the very thing that she said she wanted to look at. One of the ways I kind of try to be honest with myself about like what am I working on and what's important for me. beyond the goals, because the goals are great. Like, again, I want to be a black belt in jiu-jitsu. I want to build my breathwork brand. I want to write new books. But then there's the stuff life is giving me. So I often ask people, like, if I was to meet you 6 months from now and there was 3 challenges that are currently tripping you up, or even one, and you were past that in 6 months, what would that challenge be? Not a goal to move toward, but something that's kind of almost like Muhammad Ali used to say, it's not the mountain ahead that'll tire you out, it's the pebble in your shoe, or something like that. So it's like, what are the pebbles in our shoe that are tripping us up? Are you drinking too much? Are you too much on your phone? Are you resenting your partner and not sharing what's going on for you? Like, that's the stuff I think that can really free up a lot of energy for us.
Yeah, it's looking at those kind of daily habits and routines that you probably don't even realize that you're doing until you kind of take a step back and do a full self-audit almost. We had a guy in here recently, Shane Flynn. I'm not sure if you know him.
I've come across his stuff on Primal Podcast.
He was in, and we just released that episode a couple of weeks ago and got a really, really good reaction. One of the core aspects of what Shane does is it's not just physical therapy, that someone will come in, and he's very big on athletes and injuries and kind of helping them with injuries, and it is all physical. But they're guys who have gone to different physios, physical therapists, and whoever else they've tried, and maybe not got a solution, or maybe it's something that comes and goes. And he'll come in, sit down, and within a couple of minutes he'll say, oh, well, you're stressed, or you have unmet tension from something that happened in your past, and things like that, which is really interesting to see how he has linked physical and mental side, or the inside with the outside, with the physical. It's an unusual practice that I think a lot of people, he's doing quite well, and he's quite well known, and he has a long waiting list and all of that. But I do think a lot of people still haven't really bought into that the psychological side, stress and anything else, trauma, mental trauma from your past, can manifest itself physically with physical ailments in currently or down the line as well.
I last year I did 5 weeks of body work training that was all around that, like deep tissue massage for emotional release. And it was wild. I mean, we were doing modules where we had gloves on, and you were putting your hands in people's mouths and helping them release their jaw, and there were certain spots you would hit where anger would come and anxiety would come and fear would come, because the theory behind a lot of that work, which is like body-based psychotherapy, is again, we can think about stress as being in the mind, but if you walk out on the street there and someone threatens you, you're going to have a very physical response. You might fight back because you got a jiu-jitsu background, but if you don't have that capacity, you'll freeze, but the energy will run through your body. So like if someone shouts at me when I'm a child and I get overwhelmed by that, fear runs through my body. So there's a tension, I lose my voice, my breath gets shallow. There's a lot of adrenaline flying up, but it has nowhere to go. Animals in the wild will fall on their side and they'll shake and tremor when they have that kind of response, because they need to use the energy. But we leave the energy in our system, and it becomes armor almost. Or you think about a little boy that's told not to cry, you'll see him go, and he'll kind of almost push it down. And so the theory with a lot of that work is that you physically hold tension around the areas that are emotional hotspots, if you will, or dead spots where you've kind of numbed yourself. So it is really interesting it was funny, I did my first module in Poland, and there's like 50 people there, and I was completely overwhelmed. I'd never done any bodywork stuff before. I show up, everyone's naked. I'm just like, this is kind of what. And they said, okay, grab a partner, you can do an hour-long session. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I had to work with someone. And that room was just wild. There was a lot of plant medicine people in that room, and like just people that were quite out there. So everyone's screaming and shouting and emotional releases. And so I got involved, I was just like, adapt to my environment. But then a couple of weeks later, I did my second module in France. So it was the same modality, but a different group. So I kind of assumed like, that's just what happens. So day one, I'm on the table. Someone starts pressing on my stomach. I'm like, I start beating up the table and just going wild, just like I did in Poland. There's just silence in the room. I'm like the only one making any noise or having any release. And the facilitator comes up, like, is everything okay? I'm like, yes, no, that's what we're supposed to do. But it kind of gave other people permission to do similar. But
yeah. I suppose it's like any group of people. You find a certain group of people doing a certain activity, and you'll find a different group of people doing the exact same activity in a very, very different way.
Yeah.
And well,
Jiu-Jitsu
is one of those things, but
it's all permission based. Like, it's all sort of like, the big question for us all, this is happening without us realizing it, is, am I safe? Like, am I safe to be myself? So if you go to a jiu-jitsu club and everyone's doing no-gi and they've got their rash guard on and no one's got their top off, then you're probably going to assume, okay, well, don't take your top off here. That's not how they conduct themselves here.
Yeah.
If you go to somewhere else, everyone's got their top off, then you just go along with it. So it speaks to the power of environment. If there's any sense of, I'm not going to be safe, I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be ridiculed, I'm going to be shamed, we'll adapt. And I think a well-lived life requires putting yourself in environments where you feel safe that you can be yourself. And like you mentioned, being in the corporate world a couple of years ago, and by the sounds of it, maybe you couldn't be who you wanted to be. You didn't feel safe to dress a certain way or be a certain way. And
it was that feeling of being someone that I wasn't, around people who are different to me, I felt. And it was a case of, well, I either conform to that or get out of it and find an avenue or an area where I can be who I feel like I am internally. Took a few years between leaving that and finding, let's say, here in the group that we have here, to find that kind of comfort level. But it is difficult to go through that, and I think a lot of people just conform, really, and that's where there's a lot of anger in the world, and I think a lot of that comes from people conforming and not realizing that they can step back and there is going to be a group somewhere that they'll slot into, let's say. And it's, I suppose, that feeling of being comfortable to put yourself in an uncomfortable situation. Like, you've said that a couple of times now, you've put yourself in quite a few uncomfortable situations, which probably weren't really uncomfortable. It's just your perception of that, where you're going.
50 naked Polish people and having to do bodywork.
That's a little bit uncomfortable, yeah, I'd imagine so. You put yourself in quite an uncomfortable situation a long time ago as well, when you went to train pretty much professional MMA back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. I'm going to be a bit selfish and ask you about that story, because I've heard you speak about it briefly a couple of times, but back when, I think the dichotomy of who you are now with the deep introspection and the shadow self and everything that you're kind of doing and looking into, contrasted with someone who went to essentially be a cage fighter when no one was doing cage fighting, is quite a contrast.
Yeah. I guess what drove it was probably a lot of, again, that insecurity. So like, I was bullied a bit when I was young, and I found my way. I've had strategies of kind of adapting. So I played a bit of team sport. I became a funny guy at times. I became, I don't know, a tough guy at times. I started lifting weights. And when I was a teenager, I found judo. It was kind of a weird thing how it happened. I was obsessed with professional wrestling, like obsessed. And I messaged the school when I was 14 or 15, emailed the school in England, and I said, I have to finish school, but then I'm coming to wrestling school. What can I do in the next 4 years to kind of get myself ready? And your man said, start lifting weights so you can get strong, and start learning judo so you know how to fall without hurting yourself.
Wow, right, okay.
Yeah, so I go back to school the next day. I look on the notice board, this judo class. It's kind of a law of attraction thing. I'm like, holy crap, this is cool. Started judo, and within weeks I'd won an Irish schools title. Like, nobody was doing it at the time, but it really gave me a lot of confidence. And then I started boxing. I was like the only non-traveler in the boxing club. And then I started Thai boxing. There was a bit of jiu-jitsu happening in Galway. I was just chatting to a friend the other day who used to do it back then as well. He would have been 10 years, 15 years older than me. We used to rent the squash courts, and this is like old school. Like, I don't know, with John Kavanagh, maybe I've been a purple belt or something. No, actually, that's a lie. I think he would have been a black belt. I remember Gunnar Nelson. I didn't know who Conor McGregor was at the time. Gunnar Nelson, though, was like a prodigy. He was this. And I was doing an arts degree, geography and economics. Like, it was the thing to do if you didn't know what you wanted to do with your life. And I just wasn't, like, I hated it. I made 9 lectures in my first year, like 5 lectures in my second year. I was just drinking all the time. And I've always been a bit of a dreamer, and also willing to put myself in environments. Like, I recognize now looking back. So I emailed a bunch of MMA gyms in California. Everyone was going on their J1s, and I said, I'll do it differently. So one gym got back to me, and they said, we'll give you a place to stay. You can clean the gym, you can live in the gym. And so I went, and I remember like 18, couple of €100 in my pocket, and I remember shaking my dad's hand at the airport. It was like this kind of emotional moment when, you know, there's no hugs or anything like that, but he's like, good luck, you know. And then maybe a month later, my mum rings and she's like, there's kids after calling up to the house saying that you're cage fighting out there. You told us you were doing judo. And I'm like, oh crap, you know. I'm down in Tijuana having like smoker fights and all this kind of thing. They used to have smoker fights, which was just amateur fights, really. But yeah, I spent 2 summers there. Dominic Cruz was there. War Machine was there.
Old school.
Met Rampage Jackson. It was, I don't know what timeline that was. You're probably UFC 60 or something like that. And it was amazing. Like we had some wild. Like there was a time. it was wild. I think I guess I was 18 or 19. War Machine. He's like life in prison now for attempted murder and stuff. But War went to do. He legally changed his name to War. I mean, his proper name was Jonathan, but I think WCW at the time, the wrestling organization, had a wrestler called War Machine. So he said he'd legally change his name so he wouldn't have to, you know, copyright. I don't know. But he went to film The Ultimate Fighter, and then I moved into his room. I remember, like, I'd be looking around his room. There'd just be women's phone numbers everywhere. He'd just be meeting, and he'd have in brackets like pole dancer Sarah, and then he'd have like he was just out talking to women, and then he'd bring me places with him. He'd be like, hey Divs, they always call me Divs. Hey Divs, use that accent with these girls. But there was one of the guys who was fighting in Fresno, which is close to LA, and they had no corner man apart from War. So I said I'd go as well, and I was useless. Like I was not a good fighter.
Just there for the experience, really.
Yeah, and I remember. We were fighting the hometown guy. Billy Evangelista was the guy's name, and our guy was Ryan Bixer, who had come out of Pat Militich's team back in the day. And we're backstage, and I'm looking around, like, there's all these famous fighters who to me at the time were famous. Like I remember Josh Thompson was there, and so we're fighting the hometown guy. There's thousands of people there, and we're in the backstage area, and they started announcing us. And it was like just this, the energy of getting booed out of the place and people throwing stuff at us, and War Machine's going crazy. He's like, you got, like, he's ready. And just wild times out there. Just so I spent 2 summers there, and then I came back to Ireland, and I kind of stopped. I had a friend out there who was like a mentor to me. He was 28 and I was 18. And he was big into TRX and kettlebells and all this stuff that hadn't taken off here yet.
Ahead of his time, really,
Yeah. Pavel Satsulin had just gone to America, I think, with the kettlebells. Okay. And so he was a mentor to me. We used to go to the beach, and again, he'd be using me with my Irish accent to talk to women. And he'd be telling me, hey, Pat's fighting down in Mexico the weekend. You guys should join us. And he's just like getting women's phone numbers out there. But he was really struggling with his mental health. And he took his own life when I got home, which woke me up, and kind of like, I finished my arts degree, but I said, I'm going to do what Eric did. Like, I'm going to pursue fitness, and like, that's going to be my life. And I parked the martial arts then for 10 years. And it's funny how things redirect our lives.
Come around in circles as well. There's, a lot of those people, I would imagine, War Machine being probably the pinnacle of it, lived on ego and, probably weren't that introspective. So I'd imagine there's a lot of characters back then who, if they saw you now, would probably wonder if it's the same person or not.
It's funny how they've all ended up. I mean, Dominic Cruz is a very kind of introspective guy in some ways.
I suppose he's a little bit of an outlier in that group.
Yeah. War has found God now that he's in prison. I think
finding God in prison is a bit of a
to do.
Something to do, and maybe something of a, is there a chance I could get out of a life sentence here? Maybe that's a little bit tactical, but no, fair play to him. The balance of the physical and mental when it comes to, like, I don't know if you work too much with professional athletes now or anything like that, but it does seem like the sports psychology side has become massive in terms of, I suppose it's a little bit maybe as well in terms of what Shane Flynn does, of managing your body through managing your mind. But then there's the sports psychology aspect of, I know in competition, for example, even at the level that I'm at as essentially a hobbyist jiu-jitsu athlete. I'm not going to say athlete, that's jiu-jitsu person, participant. Let's go with that.
You're an athlete.
I do find that like all the physical preparation that you can do, the psychological side of it is the most challenging and the most difficult to, like, I think physical is quite, I don't mean to disrespect anyone in the physical therapy or personal training side, but the physical side is, it can be, there's science-based approaches that you can do, and it can be quite straightforward. Obviously it gets in depth, but the psychological side is very, very difficult to, even if you have a professional helping you, it's very difficult to find that what it is within you, that fight, flight or freeze aspect that you kind of touched on from a competition point of view, of how do you manage that, and is like jiu-jitsu specifically, of it being a one-off, you train for 6, 8, 12 weeks and you have a competition coming up, and then you have that one day where you need to perform, versus let's say a team sport where you're competing every week. It's slightly different, but that psychological aspect of how do I ensure that my body is ready to cope mentally as well as physically. Do you touch on that much in terms of what you do as well, or is it more so about the kind of personal development side, or do you kind of blend your two worlds in the, within those?
I don't really do much in the performance and sports side. I have a couple of friends like Gary Cully, will say, who's a professional boxer, who I, informally give a bit of support to before fights and just have a chat, but it's kind of an interesting one. I remember, like, I did a master's in exercise and nutrition science. That's where I started before I was doing personal training and stuff, and we'd study athletes and professional athletes, and I thought I wanted to work with athletes in a strength and conditioning context, and then it came to it, and I was like, oh geez, you're the first guy to get blamed as the strength and conditioning coach if something goes wrong, and there's not really any kind of upside if things go right. But something we kind of came to see was that, like, if someone, let's say high performance and health do not go together a lot of the time. Like, we were looking at, say, hurdlers, runners and hurdlers, and we're saying their hips are goosed from their performance, and so you're not necessarily stepping in and trying to get them as functional as possible from a health perspective. You're trying to get them to the best they can be in terms of their sport. And I guess there's probably a bit of that when it comes to the highest level of performers in jiu-jitsu. Some of them probably have demons that if they address those demons, who knows, the wheels might come off and they might not be the performers they are anymore. So there's that element to it, that maybe our pain or our trauma or some of that stuff drives us and it distracts us, and that might be perfect too. I suppose the practical pieces in terms of skill sets for performing at our best from a psychological standpoint, I talk about emptying the bucket sometimes. So if you think about, like, stress in your life being the accumulation of, like, a bucket filling. So you've got your family stress, you've got your work stress, you've got your training stress, you've got your unexpected insurance bill that comes through, right? You've got all these different stresses. If you don't have a place to empty the bucket and de-stress every now and then, the bucket will overflow at some stage. So I think it's important to have a consistent practice. So that could be yoga, it could be yoga nidra, it could be meditation, it could be going out in nature. So that's an important aspect, is on a weekly basis, not waiting until you get burnt out or you get overwhelmed, but actually making it something where you recognize there's always stress in my environment and I need a proactive approach to emptying the bucket. So that's one piece. The second piece then is, how do I deal with things when they come up in the moment? So if I go into a competition and I haven't been emptying the bucket, I'm going to be at my capacity, and my window of tolerance is not going to be very, high, or not very big. So it's not going to take much to tip me over the edge and make me overwhelmed. Even if I've emptied the bucket and I'm feeling quite grounded and I'm feeling in a good place going into the competition, nerves are going to be normal. So I think the second piece is, do I have tools for regulating myself in the moment? So that could be simple practices. That could be mantras that you give yourself. John Danaher had a great analogy he used years ago. Did you ever hear him talking about the plank?
Possibly. I think it sounds familiar, yeah.
He told this story about, I know it's easier in theory than it is in reality, but he said when he was in school, there was 2 buildings side by side, and one day this magician came in and he put a plank across the 2 buildings, and he walked across the buildings, and all the kids were just mesmerized. They're like, wow, that's incredible, and they're just blown away. And then he took the plank and he came down to ground level and he put the plank on the ground and he had them walk across it. And he said it's the same plank. The only thing that changed was, like, the environment or the consequences, if you will. And he said sometimes with competition, we go into a competition and we're doing the same thing we are every day in the gym, but we put these massive expectations on ourselves. So That's the other piece, I suppose, is just touching base with yourself in that regard. If I do work with athletes, I'll talk to them about like understanding who they are beyond the identity of being an athlete, because someday the athlete part is going to die, or it's going to transition into something else, and you have to be more than one. You have to love yourself in more than just one aspect of your life, I think.
Yeah, that's probably something that, well, getting off topic a little bit, but that professional athletes probably do struggle with, is there always is going to be an end point. Fair enough, there's some sports like golf or whatever where you can keep going a little bit longer, but there's going to be an end point. And I feel like in fighting in particular, a lot of them, and even, especially in jiu-jitsu, resorting to extracurricular supplements that is probably trying to prolong that. And that's probably a bit of ego as well, of trying to, this is their identity, all they've ever known. And it's, I suppose, a big thing. I'm trying not to keep this coming back to jiu-jitsu, but I can't help it. That there's a lot of people, and it's something from, let's say, from me starting the brand within jiu-jitsu, that I very, very quickly, when I started, realized that this was, like you spoke about, community and the meditative aspect or whatever, that I really enjoyed it from the start. And I thought, okay, I really want to be involved in this in more than just a participant point of view. I was in my mid-20s when I started it, and had already had multiple surgeries, so I kind of knew I'm not going to be at the top level of this thing. It's going to take a long time, like you spoke about the journey of it. It's going to take a long time to get to a point where I could make a living from teaching it. I knew absolutely nothing at the time. So what's the other aspects? Something that I know is, okay, sourcing clothing, marketing, I'll try and set up a clothing brand. And it was essentially my attempt at trying to embed myself in the jiu-jitsu scene. But there's the aspect of it with the athlete side that so many people would look at it from a different perspective than I did, and say, well, the only way to do it is to train full time and make a living from jiu-jitsu, which is essentially, well, it's maybe a little bit easier now than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago, but still very, very difficult. And I think that there is probably a serious ego aspect, that maybe people don't use it as the tool that, say, me or you would use it from a mental clarity point of view, and that as well. But
I was just going to say, I think there's, we talk about needs earlier, and the different needs that we have, like need for connection, need for community, need for growth, need for contribution. I would never tell anyone how to live their lives, but I think it can be problematic trying to meet all your needs in one place, in the same way as having a partner and trying to have your partner meet all of your social needs is probably not going to be ideal, because it puts huge pressure on them. So if someone only has jiu-jitsu in their life, and it meets their professional needs, it meets their financial needs, it meets their community needs, who are you when jiu-jitsu falls away? And can you still enjoy it? Because now there's this massive expectation and pressure on it, versus maybe the person who's got a job and they've got their family and then they've got a hobby on the side and then they also do jiu-jitsu. Maybe that person, well, everyone's different, but certainly that person's going to get as much from it as the next,
Yeah, I was going to kind of touch on that towards like a business standpoint, that trying to balance business and enjoyment, and that aspect of do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. It's not necessarily true either. I'm sure, like someone who owns a massive bin company or whatever, like that someone could have a massive company and be doing really well. I'm sure they don't like collecting bins, or they're not that interested in rubbish, but they still make a nice living and they do really well, versus someone who is passionate about something in particular, like you with self-development. Let's bucket it as that, and then making a living out of that, but you're kind of finding that balance. How do you balance that in terms of, well, you obviously have to make a living, you have to like be an entrepreneur, let's say you are a business owner, Pat, just so you know. How do you balance that with the like spiritual side of trying to kind of help people as well as make a living out of it, let's say?
The whole thing about, if you like what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. I think probably a more accurate description is you're going to suffer in your life. Decide what's worth suffering for. You're going to suffer.
I like that spin, yeah, okay.
Whatever partner you choose, you're going to fight and you're going to argue and you're going to be challenged, but make sure it's worth it. And there's, whatever work you choose. Like my work, I don't like being out there. I don't like having to put myself out there on social media. I don't particularly love having to not having to. I enjoy it when I come to do it, but speaking on stage is my biggest fear. So like that's something I had to kind of lean into. So there's elements of my work that certainly would not be the things I would choose. I have to suffer for them, but it's worthwhile because it gives me a sense of purpose and meaning and contribution and fulfillment, and it gives me a lifestyle that I want. I often say I'm not an entrepreneur. I suppose I see myself as a lifestyle entrepreneur, if you will. I'm trying to support the lifestyle that I want. In terms of contribution, I mean, Zig Ziglar had a quote years ago that's worth always coming back to. And he said, if you help enough people get what they want in life, you can have everything that you want. I think that's useful. So if you help enough people get what they want in life, you can have everything that you want. So it's probably going to become more important. I don't know a lot about AI, but I mean, you know, as AI comes in and more jobs fall into the wayside, I think I'm thinking about that because as I write a book at the moment, I'm like, is anyone actually going to be writing their own books in the coming years, or is everything going to be AI generated? So then I start to think about, well, what's the most valuable commodities as AI comes in more and more, like in terms of us, and it's probably our depth, our presence, our humanity, so those qualities are important to bring across in our work. It's probably a bit of a tangent, but
yeah, the AI aspect is like, I know you say about jobs falling to the wayside. Jobs are going to fall to the wayside, but I think it's going to create new jobs. But I think the jobs that are going to fall to the wayside are, I hesitate to bracket it all as admin jobs, but I think it's going to be jobs where people don't have a sense of purpose anyway. I think that's going to drive a lot of people towards finding something that does give them a sense of purpose. So I might be a little bit naive, or looking at this in its best light when it might not necessarily be that. But I do think that AI could potentially, I've kind of only had this realization over the last few weeks, that AI could potentially push people towards what they actually prefer to do, rather than meaningless admin tasks that a lot of the time are governments or companies creating paperwork to create jobs to seem like they're growing or they're being valuable and providing a benefit to society. That AI is going to pull a lot of that back and push people towards being a bit more inherently happy with what they do on a day-to-day basis.
This is probably a bit of a sideline, but there's a story coming to me that a friend of mine was telling me years ago. He used to work in a factory. Him and all the lads worked in this factory, and they all hated it. They complained about it every day. Now they were young, so they wasn't their forever job, if you will, but they hated it except for one guy, and he'd always turn up with a smile on his face, and they thought he was like soft in the head, or he was daft, or, you know, what's the story with this guy? And eventually they said, like, how do you enjoy this? And he said, I don't enjoy this. And they said, why are you always smiling? And he said, well, every day I show up, I put a bit of money in the bank, and eventually I'm going to go and work in a safari in Africa. That's my dream. So he was doing the same thing as them, but he was coming with a different intent. One by one, they all left the factory and got different jobs, except for him. He was the last one standing. 10 years later, one of them bumped into him at a pub at Christmas or something. They said, I haven't seen you in ages. He said, I moved to Africa. I'm working in a safari now. And it was just that idea of, you know, talking about purpose. Sometimes people think purpose begins the day that I start my dream job. And for me, purpose begins the day you show up to your existing job with a sense of what it's supporting in the future. Because I think a lot of people get trapped, you know, they're working in a corporate space and they don't love it anymore, and they want to set up a jiu-jitsu brand, for example, and they live in the future, like with this idea of the jiu-jitsu brand, rather than thinking, can I take a half an hour this evening to draw some sketches, or can I put 10% of this week's wage into an account? Or the dream starts when you start, you know, showing up with a different intention, and purpose comes back online then.
Probably got to do it. Could have done with being told that 6 years ago when everyone started the brand. Yeah,
me too. I actually I bought trainjujitsu.com. I have that domain. I think it's quite a good name. So I want to do something in the jiu-jitsu space at some stage, but I don't know what that is.
Yeah, we'll find the route for that. I'm gonna ask you our what are they called? Quick fire questions. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. So
yeah, thank you.
We'll fly through these because we're gonna go and do a bit of training.
Yeah.
And we've interacted a little bit online over the last year or two, and I've seen you training a lot, and I've heard about some people that have trained with you and said you're very good, so I want to see how good you actually are.
Interesting.
So
okay.
Let's see what the standard's like. But
Okay.
we'll fly through these quick fire questions first. What's your favorite holiday destination?
Thailand, Phuket.
You spent a bit of time there recently.
Yeah, just been a couple of months there. Phuket Grappling Academy. Shout out to Ben Royal and all them over there. Yeah.
Nice shout out there. Your favourite gym exercise?
Hate the gym. No, I don't hate the gym. I don't know. Dumbbell bench press.
Classic. Beach weights. Who's your childhood idol?
Jeff Hardy, professional wrestler.
Oh, nice. Yeah, big fan of that answer. Best piece of advice you've been given?
I give myself this advice because I'm so wise. Enjoy the chapter of life you're in. So I think it's very easy to think about where you should be or where you could be or where you're supposed to be or any of that kind of stuff, and it pulls you away from where you are. So if you're single, enjoy being single. If you're in a relationship, enjoy being in a relationship. If your kid's keeping you awake all night, enjoy the fact that you're at that stage of your kid's life, and just enjoy the chapter you're in as much as you can. Don't fight with reality.
Nice. Yeah. Powerful. What day in your life would you like to relive?
In 2015, maybe I brought 540 people to Tough Mudder. It was the world's biggest team for a Tough Mudder run, and we raised 165 grand for Cystic Fibrosis Ireland. I think I'd like to do it again because so much of that time in my life was being insecure and being stuck in my head, and so I didn't get to fully enjoy most of, like I did the Late Late Show, and I was nervous and I was shy, and all these experiences that were happening in that magical time of my life that I feel I didn't really get to enjoy fully because there was this insecurity of, am I doing this right?
Yeah.
So I'd like to be back there and see the 500 people and be able to take it in that I brought these people together, and it was special because it was 500 people from so many different backgrounds that didn't think they could do it, but we created a culture of, I talked about culture earlier, making people feel safe. I was meeting people on the street. I was like, come to Tough Mudder. And they're like, I couldn't do that. I'm like, of course you could. And I don't know who these people are. So I didn't have no idea, So, yeah.
Well, that's impressive as well. You're impressing me. What's your favorite song to relax to?
The first one coming to me now is Jose Gonzalez, Heartbeat. Good tune, isn't it?
Fan of that, Richie. It means nothing to me, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
The most influential person in your life?
My father. And when I say that, sometimes people think that means we get on all the time, and I think we definitely challenge each other and have different views in a lot of ways. But it's kind of cliche, but I find the older I get, the more kind of his kind of common, sense approach and simple way of living makes more sense to me. Like, I remember getting trolls and stuff when I first came online years ago, and I saw it as online bullying and stuff. And my father just said to me, like, 2 years from now, you're not gonna bat an eyelid. You're gonna realize there's more important things in life than what's going on in the internet, and just stuff like that. Or, he would just never have lived a life like this where he's put himself out there. So he'd be telling me keep the head down and just focus on the basics and look after the basics. And yeah, he's a good influence.
Okay, well, even though you think that you're not a business owner, what do you hate most about running your own business?
Marketing, probably. having to communicate things that are hard to put words on in words.
Yeah, it's quite difficult that sometimes.
Do you know anyone?
What do you love most about running your own business?
I feel I can be myself in my work, in my personal life. I feel there's very little difference between who I am on stage, on podcast, in the pub, on the jiu-jitsu mats. I feel I'm authentic in that way.
And if you got €100,000 this will be an interesting answer, €100,000 to invest in your company, what would be the first thing you would do with it?
Gary asked me last week, what would you do if you won 10 million in the morning? I said I wouldn't do anything different. 100,000. I'd probably build a facility in Galway that would be a jiu-jitsu gym / breathwork facility / community hub, and I would take a step back and I'd bring people in to run all of those things. I wouldn't actively want to be teaching consistently because I like to travel and do my own thing, but I'd like to have a community space in Galway that brings together that kind of environment.
all your passions in one place, essentially.
Yeah.
Nice.
And a space where it wouldn't have to be my passions. You know, there could be art classes, there could be music, there just a space.
A functional, multifunctional space.
Yeah.
That's a nice answer. Pat, thanks a million.
Pleasure.
Appreciate you coming down.
It's a long journey. I'm nervous now for the jiu-jitsu.
It's all right. I haven't been training that much recently, so thanks a million. Pleasure. Great to see you. And if anyone wants to find out more about you, best place is probably Instagram.
PatDivilly.com or Instagram. Do you know, I'm starting a Substack. I want to start writing more because I really find social media kind of challenging.
It's difficult to get your full thoughts across as well.
Yeah. And I question sometimes how much value am I really adding with that versus what might be possible in a different form. So I'm not sure what.
Especially with what you do inherently, you probably need a little bit more space to be able to get your thoughts and ideas across.
Yeah.
Okay. Keep an eye out for that.
Legend.
Pat, thanks a million.